how delightful to see you, Brendan. Thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed by me for this B4 series on the challenges of leadership during the pandemic.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Good. So just for those viewers who don't know Brendan or me very well, Brendan is Brendan Hattam, Centre Director of the Westgate, Oxford, and this means that he's in the or head of the retail property of Landsec PLC. Which some of you may not have heard of, but you will all have heard of the Westgate, Oxford. And so this is its very own centre director. I'm delighted to have you here, Brendan. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alison Haill, CEO of Oxford Professional Consulting, which is my own business. I founded it 22 years ago, and where I work as an executive business coach with corporate C-suite and senior leaders, and also doing some work with entrepreneurs like myself, sharing my secrets of success so they can also make their small businesses profitable and sustainable. So that's who I am, and I've got Brendan here with me. This is going to be a short, bite-sized video interview so that you can all listen, get good ideas from it, and then carry on with your own work tasks. So question number one, Brendan, I want to ask you, what challenges have you experienced in leadership during this pandemic, extraordinary time we've had?
I think there's two things. The first thing is uncertainty. Because as you can imagine, in the business that I work in, which, retail, hospitality, food and beverage, it has been impacted particularly by the pandemic. So there's been a lot of change in a short space of time. A lot of it is externally generated, of course, because the government has guidelines on what we can do. And sometimes those guidelines have been implemented very quickly. So uncertainty is the first factor. And then the second challenge really is around communication. Because we work with a team here of 3,500 people. And of course, if you're not there, or if you're working from home, that's a very different dynamic for us. This isn't an industry that does working from home. We generally need to be there.
Yeah.
So it's a brand new challenge for us to get used to that.
Yes, that's an interesting point, because in retail, of course, you're face to face. It's all about being live in the moment with the customer, isn't it? And so I can see that working from home is different from an office-based business, for instance. So that's an interesting point. Now I'll carry on to my second question, which is, apart from those things that you've noticed, and you mentioned uncertainty and the working from home thing, and also these sudden changes from government, I'm sure that's been particularly difficult. But apart from that, what have you observed in other leaders or leadership in other spheres?
I think a need to be flexible, because again, I think with the situation we're in, you do need to be agile, to be able to move very quickly. And I think that you need to adapt your style for that. So, you can't give full certainty because you're not in a certain situation. So I suppose as a leader, you need to be able to be transparent enough with everybody to tell them that this is the situation we're in, and we'll take it stage by stage. So that's the difficulty. And again, I'd throw in communication with that, because we're only seeing each other perhaps 20% of the time compared to before. So that means the communication we have needs to be pretty planned and precise to get the best out of it. So that's very different to, talking to somebody who you might bump into 3 or 4 times a day. And it's amazing how much information you give to each other when you bump into each other 3 or 4 times a day. So it's a very different dynamic.
Yes, I think that, and that's a word that you've used a couple of times. The dynamic is different. So communication has to be different. It can't be spontaneous, and it's got to be planned. And you talked about the need for agility, which of course means pivoting on the spot, and some of the things you can't plan for, can you? Just got
No.
to be in the moment.
That's right. I mean, particularly in our industry, an example would be the wearing of face masks in public. I mean, that was announced less than 24 hours before implementation.
Gosh, yes.
So, you know, that level of change is pretty intense. And of course, you're then in a situation where you have to implement it quickly. But do people understand it? You know, do they agree with it? But from a management point of view, yes, that level of change so quickly really tests a manager's ability to communicate and look credible to their teams.
Yes, yes. So there's credibility, there's transparency, there's agility, there's all these things, and you've obviously noticed other people as well. Just pivoting, to use that word, which is rather overused during the last few months. Thinking about Jacinda in New Zealand, why do you think she's been so acclaimed, really, so held up as an example of good leadership?
I think that her leadership style is more collaborative, and that collaborative style, with a sufficient degree of transparency thrown in, allows you to be more flexible. I think if I go back to the leaders I started to work with, this is in business, I'm going back, 30 years here, there was a lot of personality leaders. They were character people, and that they were leaders because of their reputation rather than their ability. They weren't particularly collaborative, and that wasn't part of it. So I think with her, I think that her style allows her to take different positions on things, which is great, because that's exactly what you want to be able to do in a very fast changing situation.
Yes, yes. It's interesting that you mentioned collaboration, because that was that's one of my favorite questions, which I might bring in here because you've touched on it, which is in the leadership training world and the leadership coaching world, they're talking about the fact that the time for the hero leader is past, and the problems that we're faced with these days just can't be solved by one person. It's the day for the collaborative leader. That's the way we have to lead in order to go forward. Sounds as if you agree with that.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think, again, if I use my example, that, we're in a city centre, we have lots of partners in the city centre, whether it's to do with transport or tourism or the student community. And we're all impacted by it. It's like its own ecosystem. So we have to collaborate with them to be able to work through it. So that's vitally important, and this agility and flexibility, I think, is a huge thing at the moment, and being open to new ideas is equally as important. I think being stuck in a certain way of working as a leader is not a particularly good place to be at the moment.
Well, that's very diplomatic way of putting it. So on to my next question then. I think you've actually you've covered one of my questions, so I'm going to leave that one. On a continuum from transparency to certainty, and I know this is a rather unusual continuum, but I've specially designed it for you. So on a continuum from transparency to certainty, where is your style, and where do you think leadership needs to be in the pandemic or a crisis like this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I think I would put myself somewhere near the middle of that scale. And the reason for that is, again, I think you've got to be transparent in this situation, because you have to be honest with people because of the uncertainty of it. I think that's vitally important. But equally, I think as a leader, you've also got to show quite a lot of certainty as well. I think that, people do need some comfort, if you like, by having a direction. So that is needed. So you've still got to, be open with people and transparent, but equally, you've still got to have a strategy, even if that strategy is to tell everybody we don't know exactly what's going to be happening in a week's time, and we will be flexible, and this is how we're going to get through it. That's certainty, if you like, in a situation that is uncertain, if I could put it like that. And it's also transparent.
Yes. So it sounds like we're centering around communication again, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that the transparency is important to show that you don't know everything, or that you don't know what's going to happen next. And it sounds like the certainty is verging on confidence. Is it the way that you put it over? Is it your tone?
I think that's got a lot to do with it. Yeah, tone's got a lot to do with all styles of leadership, I think. But it's about showing as well that even though you don't know what's happening necessarily in a week's time, you've got a system in place. And because there's a strong system in place, you know that can flex and everybody can work to it. So that's your inner certainty, with rapid change going on. So again, in the industry I work in, if you lock down with the pandemic, we're on to our second lockdown now. And those are huge changes compared to what you would normally go through. So all you can do, I think, in that situation is have a strong system to deal with the changes and accommodate the sort of the peaks and the troughs of what's going on. And I think people respect that, and they're also part of it. You need to collaborate with them to bring them in as well, and you've got to do that deliberately. At the moment, where I'm working now, I am normally working in a building full of people. At the moment, there is just a handful of people in the building at this time. So, I've still got to communicate with a lot of people, but in a very different way to what I was doing before the pandemic.
Yes, so we come back to communication again.
Yeah.
One last point on the transparency. When you say transparency is important, do you think it's important to say, I don't know what's going to happen next? None of us do.
Yeah, I do, because again, with some of the issues we're dealing with at the moment, that's absolutely true. We don't know when the pandemic will end, or when there'll be a vaccine, or whatever. So I think, yeah, we have to actually say that to people. And I think there's no point in pretending that we may know different and that we have the answers. I think that's when your credibility, and perhaps if you weren't flexible enough in your leadership style, I think that's when it would look a bit questionable.
Absolutely. And there's one point which I always think is difficult. if you think that by saying the truth, you're going to worry people even more, where do you think you stand on transparency there? Because I think that's sometimes when leaders think, well, I shouldn't say that because it's going to really push some people over the edge. What's your view there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a case of, this is where maybe judgment comes in and experience comes in, about just knowing where to go, you know, on a scale, say, of 1 to 10. Are you telling people things, or are you discussing things, or is there a middle ground where you know, you're using a bit of both? I mean, the traditional hero leader, the character leader, would just tell people things.
Mm.
It wasn't necessarily, you know, about discussing things with them.
But they'd also hold some stuff back, wouldn't they? That
Oh,
hero
they certainly
leader,
would, yeah.
they'd probably hold a lot back.
Yeah, most certainly, yes. So not particularly transparent.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, people are sensible enough to know, particularly with something like the pandemic, that, you know, it's such a large phenomenon. Everybody's heard about it. It's on the news all the time. So in one sense, that helps in a situation like this, because everybody's aware of it.
Mm.
But I think it's probably more difficult in situations where people aren't aware at all, where things
Yes, I suppose. And I think at the beginning it was probably more difficult, wasn't it? Now, I promised that I'm going to keep these interviews really short, but just to offer you a surprise question, what question would you suggest that I ask to the next interviewee? Anything that you
Yeah, I mean, it obviously would depend on the person you interview, but I think that question about, you know, transparency and where you sit is a very good question for anybody. And another one, again, it depends if it's related to the pandemic and the situation we're in, is just your attitude to change.
yeah.
How fast can you change? What's your outlook? Do you always think of change, or are you more set in your ways?
Yes. Although I should imagine most people these days wouldn't dare say they were set in their ways.
That is true.
Well, thank you so much, Brendan. That's been wonderful. And since it's Friday, I hope you have a lovely weekend, and that we'll meet again soon. Many thanks from our listeners as well.
Thank you very much.
Bye.